just before we begin the question period, the timing's been revised twice already. By the second revised timing, we stop at 5:02. But shall we just, do you want to do that or just run to the hour?
I think we'll run to the hour.
Okay, so
half an hour from break. We're all tired, so.
Okay, so make your questions extra exciting. 3 days ago. I just want to open that up again. I'm going to ask you to share that part that you're currently wearing.
Yeah. So, this is so interesting in terms of thinking about the individual and culture and cultural evolution and all this kind of thing. But it seemed to me that there was a tension between what both of you said, and especially Marie, what you emphasized, but really both of you said, which is the sort of, maybe not the minute, maybe not the hour, but it's the first weeks that people come together. They start to create a true language and perhaps a count system with a successor function. And yet, in the Munduruku we heard about this morning, and I'm sorry, and maybe this is also directed at Pierre, they're in contact with each other, they have a language, but they haven't invented that. So how do we reconcile those two sets of facts?
I think, oh, go ahead, you want to go?
Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I thought about that. I think, I don't know, if you think of the analogy of not every language has this, so why would we expect every language to have it? I mean, that's like a really weak argument, right? It's not very explanatory. I don't think that, I mean, many cultures have invented alphabets, right? Many cultures have invented numeral systems, but not all of them have. I think it's a similar kind of...
Can I just say, so perhaps, I mean, you did say that, they live in a culture where people do exchange money, and in fact they exchange money, and, there is some complexity there, which I guess is not true among the Munduruku because of, the basket of eggs is the basket of eggs, and it's always sort of the same, or whatever the exact example was. So maybe what you should be claiming is that it takes, 3 to tango, so to speak. I mean, it takes the innate core knowledge that you bring, it takes the interaction that you emphasize, but it takes interaction within a certain, level of cultural complexity. Do you need to have all those ingredients?
I mean, from the data that we have, it appears that you need all those ingredients.
Right.
I mean, yes. I'm not making a strong claim about what the conditions are for emergence of a count list in a language or in a language community. I'm just saying, observing that, yes, indeed, in Nicaragua, in the deaf community, one emerged, and it had those characteristics. Yes.
Perhaps we could claim that we would try to see whether there are advantage of the Munduruku not to have members. So one potential advantage is we know that to have members, as I try to suggest, you need to combine different knowledge. So knowledge of sets and knowledge of individuals. Then you have to do consent. And there are potential reasons you need that. It's not entirely clear that Munduruku needs. It's like Munduruku, for example, when they do spatial orientation, don't combine colors and other spatial information. And perhaps there are advantages. And that's what we have to find out. And that's what we need.
Yeah, I was just gonna, I just want to clarify. I don't think when they, after 2 weeks and they come together, they start putting together a real language. I think they start to mimic the periodicity. I think they start to draw things from each other. But that's not when I mean, I don't think they're putting together a language between their contact, they're pigeonizing. Okay. When I got to Nicaragua in the mid-'80s, there, people had the ability to there were a bunch of numbers, sort of systems around that they were using. So there were numbers for the buses that looked like, it's like 103. And there were numbers for ages and numbers for things like that. But if you actually asked someone to count, they didn't do it. So a count list wasn't there at that point. I mean, it did come in, and don't forget these kids are now they're going to school, they're getting numbers. I think that the development of a number system when you're in a situation where there's a dominant culture that has a particular kind of number system, it's going to be being given to you. If you go and try to use money or try to buy something, the shopkeepers will be doing things like this with you. Nicaraguans gesture a lot, so they're going to get it.
But if you're just one person, you know, right? That's my argument.
Well, if one person goes down to buy the vegetables, the vegetable person is probably going to try no matter what.
I agree they're going to try, but it's not enough to generate a count list.
Oh. Yeah, I think, and I do think one of the things you have to think about is always what happens when a kid goes into education? What happens when a kid, there's all kinds of things that are happening with these guys. But
can I just hold on a second? So Tecumseh, then Charles, then Gennaro, and then come back. Oh, but Luigi, sorry. I'm standing behind you, so I
I was really struck by that first example. Well, by the contrast by the little girl being interviewed by Jean Miras that you showed, Judy, and then by this guy talking about the Twin Towers that you showed. I mean, these seem totally different to my naive eye. The latter guy, the adult home signer, maybe his mother didn't understand it, but that guy had a lot of complexity and a lot of articulation that to my untrained eye looked much more like at least a pigeon, if not something more like sign. So what's the difference between these two guys? He's older, obviously, but there must be something more than that.
You saw an older woman who was equally limited.
Right, so where did that guy get so much structure? Just from talking to his mother who didn't understand it?
I mean, it's an excellent question that I think we both need to answer. I showed you an 11-year-old, I showed you an adult, I showed you a younger kid. Those kids, if it was home sign in the home, should have come to me the way that, assuming that there's no influence of the studying of the kids, I should see a kid who looks like, one of those home signers at age X or one of these home signers at age Y. But that's why I keep saying language isolates. These guys are, when I'm talking about the ones I showed you, they're isolates. They haven't seen a deaf person, they haven't seen a hearing person, they haven't interacted with anybody at that point. It makes a big difference. And the striking thing is how fast they go from that to stringing things together like crazy. The older, the more dependent on the older person. But I think, the stuff that what I saw him doing looks a lot like contact gesturing. I saw signs in there that looked like pretty standard Nicaraguan signs. So my question is, they don't interact with each other. Have they had any contact whatsoever with a deaf person? And they've had contact with you. Are you signing with them?
I don't sign with them, no.
It's not your fault.
No, I absolutely don't sign with them. So I think the contrast is also really striking, and I don't think it's just an age or maturation issue, because we've also worked with much younger home signers who are equally as fluent as that guy. They're not all that fluent, and they're much more fluent spontaneously than they are when you show them something and ask them to tell a story, because that seems like a very, very straightforward task, but it really isn't, and that's another talk that I can give another time. But it's very difficult to tell a story if you don't have a model for doing it. And sorry, I'll get back to the point. I don't think it's a result of being studied, because that guy was like that from the very first day I met him. But to get to Judy's point, these guys are almost 30 years old by now, right? So they have seen other deaf people. They don't interact regularly with any deaf people. And a couple of them at this point have learned a few NSL signs. They have not learned any grammar. The grammar doesn't look like NSL, whatever version of it you want to take. I have not sampled the population as widely as Judy, but I think you have to be careful about when you're saying someone can express only one gesture. It is often the case that they have other concomitant issues, and I think we have to rule those out.
And
I would like to see those data.
A lot of these guys look like that within a few weeks.
Well, I mean, I haven't met, the only ones I've met are people who do have some other issue going on, who are really not expressing anything at all. The people that I've worked with are really doing this kind of combining gestures from the moment that I first interact with them. And they go down to 5, 6, 7 years of age. Younger than that, it's a little, they're not as productive, usually.
Well, and even the American homesteaders, some of them enjoy things. They certainly don't
Absolutely.
like him, but they do put signs together in a way that, I mean, some signers look at that and go, whoa, that's got the prosody. That's got the prosody of sign language. I don't know what it's.
I see the theory in the city too.
I don't know. I mean, John Goldsmith thinks it's got prosody. I don't know. I can't tell. But it is there. And I know they don't know Nicaraguan Sign Language, and I know they don't know American Sign Language. So there's variability.
There's
no
variability.
question. I mean, to some extent, it's a bit of an existential thing. If you can find one kid who we're pretty sure doesn't have any contact, and he can do this, that's interesting. Then we still have to explain why the rest of them aren't doing it. But it's a slightly different kind of one.
Yeah, and Susan, I always have a hard time with the sort of siphoning through the home sign literature, because it's no exposure to American Sign Language, no exposure to a form of the natural sign language, right? But did some of these kids have access to like manually coded English at some point?
Not at the point that I've described.
Did David's parents cue with him at that point?
We got a ton of tape after he was exposed to queuing, but we haven't analyzed it. So it might have an impact. We could analyze it someday if it hasn't disappeared. But yeah. So no, they haven't had contact in that sense.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question.
This comment is for Judy. I think the importance of peer group is real, but I think the connection to theory mind is probably tangential or not quite strong. And certainly in sociolinguistics, we know children primarily learn language from the parents, and the peers only influence them until much later stage. And also, they only develop the social-linguistic valuation of accents, dialects, and the variables at somewhat later age. So that's a comment, but that's not my main.
That's a new comment to me, that they are not influenced by their peers. Where's that?
Much later, so you can actually look at actual cases of the language variation change. You can see that, say, 3-year-olds pattern like their parents, but 6-year-olds pattern like their peers. Anyway, that's not a main point. The main point, I think, is largely because I've got a hammer everything with a nail. So it seems like the discussion you have with Anne on whether or when it became a real language, it's not like I don't find structural analysis unconvincing, but it's one possibility is to do some statistical test of the expected range of diversity in the combinations and see which of the population at what time reaches the expected degree of merge.
I agree.
Yeah, I was trying to, it's about Maria's talk. I was trying to understand the structure of some of the sentences you gave. And if I understood correctly, you referred to cases in which the number expression is associated to the argument and cases which is associated to the predicate. So I was trying to understand what this means, right? Because so there are a couple of models that we can think of in the case of association with the predicate. One would be quantifier float, right? So the children have all, that's it, right? So you have a quantity expression. Some languages you have even expressions like 3, for instance, that can float from an argument. Or a kind of topic comment structure of the sort as for cups. 3 are on the table. so I was wondering if you, what you meant when you said that the number expression is associated with predicate, and if you had in mind one of these two models or maybe something else.
Yes, answer your question. So I didn't provide a lot of the details of how we coded these, but when I was saying, I was using the word sentence rather loosely. These are, the units that we analyzed were really clauses, right? They were clauses that contain predicates, and sometimes they also had arguments with them. But they were often produced, there were multiple clauses within an utterance, for example. So there's probably more complex structure going on of the kind of, potentially of the kind that you mentioned, although I think those kinds of floating quantifiers aren't so common in sign languages typologically because things tend to be, you mean the lexical quantifiers? So, right, but we don't see any lexical, that's not what's going on here because we didn't observe any lexical quantifiers other than a lot. And sometimes they produced this gesture, which I didn't talk about, which is borrowed from the hearing gestures of the culture a lot. So, I don't think it's quantifier floating here. What it really was were incorporations of these movements into the predicate that also express locative information for the large majority of the instances of predicate number devices. Have I answered your question?
Yeah. So the incorporation idea is interesting. Actually, it's something that Susan and I were discussing yesterday evening. Does that somehow correlate with the nature of the predicate? Because if you look around languages, that's Mark Baker's discovery, you basically have incorporation of an element of the nominal only with an accusative predicate, essentially, right? So is there anything like an accusative and ergative distinction or?
It's a great question, and I don't think we have, and so when we designed this task originally, we were focusing more on the accuracy aspect and not so much on the linguistic aspect, so we didn't do the same kinds of, we didn't do the right kinds of variations in the stimulus set to elicit the sentences that would answer your question. We didn't get that many, go ahead.
We might have a few.
We might have a, go ahead, Ann.
No, because we've got eats and we've got goes and we have a.
We do.
I think we could go.
Roll would be a case of an accusative.
But the go isn't marked on the go, I mean, yeah.
All right, let's
There's, it's a great question. I don't think we have the density of data to answer it, but we could do that.
Short on maybe these cases where they are incorporating directions.
So how,
Languages.
right.
Like outside. Yanis has worked on that. And language like how to get direction of the verbs, intensification of the verb action.
Yes, that's exactly what they look like, right. To the extent that we have those action type predicates, yeah.
And that mini macro.
Yes, it is. And it's there.
No, my question was very clear. One was, do they receive money from their performance? And so how they're using it?
Oh, they don't have any trouble using the money. I mean, yes, I compensate the participants for their time, generally at a generous rate for what they would otherwise earn if they were working during that time.
Yeah, so they use money and...
They do use money, yes, and we did assess their performance on monetary tasks, and they're slightly better in their accuracy when money is involved.
Although I think it has to be said that when money is involved, there's other features of those bills that they are using other than the numerical that's on them. Is it my turn now? Okay. In Chomsky's talk, I think I heard him say two things. One, that the crucial parts of language that we're genetically endowed with are the internal grammatical system and the conceptual, intentional interface, and that the use of language for communication is secondary to all of that. And that was one thing. And then the second was that a notion of natural number is, in some sense, present in the computational system of language that we're adapting. Now, however much or little you think these home signers, your home signers have.
I don't own them, I just work with them.
The home signers that you own, that you've owned for the last 10 years have, they seem not to be drawing on a notion of natural number in some crucial cases where we would. So you show that they know there's a correct answer, they're motivated to get it, and yet on these rather simple and transparent tapping tasks, they're not getting it. But presumably they have a genetically normal linguistic language endowment, a normal conceptual, intentional system, and what they're missing is a way of communicating effectively with the people around them. And so I actually have a question both for you and kind of for anyone else in the room. Is this, how do you see this in relation to the claims that Chomsky was making?
Well, I mean, I think the same, what you just laid out, the genetic endowment for language, you know, the core competency for number is also true of speakers of languages with sparse count lists. So whatever explanation we give also has to explain their performance on these tasks, which looks very similar. Am I misunderstanding part of your question?
No, I think that's actually easier to explain because one could give a cultural explanation.
Okay, well,
they need to use this set of concepts that we have. But here's a group that, as you argued, it seems that explanation seems less plausible.
I think that explanation is much less plausible because they are definitely trying to communicate about things. They're not generally successful with the numbers because their accuracy is poor. But in general, the people around them are not understanding them so well. That's another set of studies. So just to convince you that, I mean, I find Chomsky's argument that communication is secondary quite compelling for this reason, because when you take a standard set of home sign sentences that describe events like man push woman, cup fall, I mean, just very, very simple 1 and 2 argument events, and you show that set of sentences to their mothers understand them between 40 and 70% of the time, right, by picking the picture that goes with them. When you ask the mothers to respond to the same descriptions of the same events produced by their hearing other children, right, the siblings of the home signers, they range from about 70 to 98% correct. Okay, so they're able to do the task. When I show those same clips to signers of American Sign Language who have never met these people, have not lived with them for the last 20 to 30 years, have never seen any videos of Nicaraguan home sign, they respond significantly better than the mothers, except for one case where the mom was really good and the signer was really bad. Why did I bring up this data? I think that communication, as experienced by these home signers, is not driving the structure that we see. I guess what we want to see is some distinction between communication about number things versus non-number things. I mean, to get at your question as far as what it's relating to in terms of the core number conceptual system that we have. I don't know if I can say more than that at the moment. Does anyone else have something to add?
It's on.
Okay, it's on. I think that you were getting at that communication is crucial for...
Actually, I don't necessarily think communication is crucial for the development of number, but I think you may need something more than a natural language faculty to develop number.
I'm going to add one more thing. I think engagement is crucial, right? So I want to make a distinction between engagement and communication. And so we have another colleague, Rachel Mayberry, who has been working for many years on issues related to critical period for language acquisition. And she has been working with a set of deaf isolates who have, they're different from these home signers in that they haven't developed a gesture system to communicate. For various reasons, they come from immigrant families, they have very, very chaotic home lives, there's no stability of contact with a common set of communication partners or engagement partners. And they show there's both behavioral evidence, linguistic evidence, and neurological evidence that they show a very, very different pattern. I can't comment on, they show a different pattern from signers for sure. We don't have any neurological data from or brain data from the home signers that I've been working with. But so, difference between engagement and communication I think is really crucial. And there's something about engagement that seems to be very important.
Yeah, about at some point I've heard you say that perhaps there's a number factor. And sometimes you say, well, it has to be linked with the language, because you see all some of the language in it. So I'm not sure that of course, when you have full system of language with complex neurons, where you see language, getting in the system with case, with the treatment, with all these things. But in this situation, in these cases, it's hard to see. So maybe it's true that this is a small one, then something kicks in, and you get the full language kicks in.
I think that the number, we've argued that number and music and language travel in the same space in the brain. And I think that's true. I mean, one thing that we see is if you have someone who's beyond critical period in a language isolate, they're not going to have number, they're not going to have time. It's one of the characteristics that we see. When people come to us the first time, if they can count anything, it's surprising. I want it to be 10, because you get 10 fingers. It's not, it's 5. And they do this little matching things to their fingers and stuff like that. Now, if they're young enough, they can be taught numbers and they learn it. But there are plenty of people that are beyond critical period for language, and their number systems are horrendous. Now, there are people who are beyond critical period for language, but like genius level, they would womp you in chess. Those people can both be taught language and be taught math and do just fine. But you tax their cognitive load just a little bit and they tank. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on here. But I don't see people coming to me with numbers. We had a family sign group of 3 brothers who had their own little system, and they had gestures for all the different bills, and they were somehow able to go to the Honduran border and trade money. Or that woman who worked for the police officer, she would go and buy food, but it was because there was a note from someone that said, get this, and if somebody wanted to cheat her, they easily could, because she had no clue. Her house was filled with calendars. She couldn't tell the day of the week. It was for the pictures, so.
We can ask this question a lot about the cheating. I mean, it just does not occur to people around the home signers that they don't or can't count. It was so shocking to their family members that I just think no one would consider doing it, so I don't think it happens so often, but it certainly is possible.
I'll exercise Chair's prerogative then. It doesn't strike me as particularly surprising that people would be able to use bills even without being able to count. It's just like saying, okay, for melons I hand over a red thing. And
right, there's a lot of very context-based knowledge that you can draw on.
Right, it's a very inflated economy, there's a lot of bills.
The case where you're getting the guy who was good at chunking into 5s to count on his fingers, and then you seemed a bit disappointed when he went from, 13, made it to 14, then 15, he went to 22. That actually doesn't strike me quite as bad as being quite as bad as...
Well, I only showed you a little part of the,
Because what he was doing was, when it was, so 2 handfuls, plus one of the small numbers that people seem to be genuinely accurate on, that's fine. Up to the next number that they're genuinely accurate on, fine. Around 4, that's when languages in general can switch into vocals. They can't do it with exact numbers anymore. So then he knows you've got to go up, but you can't do it with the kind of very basic resources. So what he does is something which you would want to do. You add 1 to the next column. I'm not saying this is what's going on, but so you go from 10s to 20s, and then you have another small exact number at the end, which was 2 rather than 1. But
yeah, I think that you're onto something. I think it was slightly systematic in the way that you described for this guy in particular. But the other thing that he had trouble with, part of the video that happened right before that, he has trouble inhibiting the second hand. Once you put up 10, So we get these very odd errors where you put up 10 and then 3, and then if you want to say the next one is 14, you often get this.
That's an incorrect versus the transcribed.
Right?
So, that was,
so you often, it's like,
18.
no, he really meant that, sorry, this one should be 4, I'm having a cognitive issue. Right, so he says 13, and then he looks like he really means to say 14, but really what he says is 19, because he can't inhibit his hand. So that is a very, very common error that we saw. The second common error that we saw was just inability to keep track of how many 10s you did. Right, so that's a disaster. I mean, that's right. It's very, very difficult. So,
but one thing that I think is still striking about all this is that it's clear that they can learn, I would think, rather rapidly. Certainly, they've learned very effectively single summary gestures for kinds of objects, yet not a single summary gesture for non. So, I mean, the fact that they make an error of putting in one hand too many, I think, underlines that difference between the way number concepts are mapped into language for these guys and the way that other ones are. Sorry.
Well, yeah, so I have a really dumb question just to say I know nothing about this culture. Since presumably the people around them can write Arabic numerals, and
sometimes they're very
because I was wondering why aren't they teaching them to write 9 and so
I think sometimes they try, but if you don't have a concept of 9, you're going to have a hard time learning 9.
Well, yeah, but even on your story,
oh, you mean a summary?
That is this.
But you have to be. Well, that's an empirical question, right? Whether that kind of presentation, it would have to be done in this ordered way, right? The way that the count list is structured is in this stable ordered way.
So that has not been tried, to your knowledge?
No, we have considered doing an intervention study, but we haven't done it. We have 2 sort of natural experiments along those lines. We have a young home signer who was about 8. We actually watched him in the process of being not a number knower to being a 1 knower to being a 3 knower, and then he learned the count list. He was going to school at that point, and he learned the count list when he was 8 and a half about, and he was able to, I mean, as Judy suggested, still hasn't surpassed the critical period, was able then to learn to count. Right? And then we have a case of one of these adult home signers who learned the NSL, the Nicaraguan Sign Language count list, when he was 17. When he had a period of time where he interacted with some signers at that late age. He can recite the count list, but it does no conceptual work for him. When he's trying to do these tasks, he immediately reverts back to his own gestures, which don't have any fixed order and aren't reliable with respect to the quantity they're expressing. So, I mean, from those 2 data points, it does seem like there's a critical period for learning a count list and applying it to these kinds of tasks.
Yeah, I mean, I was just curious about the family input, but I guess I don't know the culture.
You don't get people, we have yet to see a family. There was one another child home signer who, his mother was very, very encouraging with him, and he was very, very good at one-to-one correspondence. His behavior data looked just like the adults. But it appeared to us that she had never modeled a gesture count list to him, anything that was systematic and ordered. He didn't use anything like that, and it didn't help him when the numbers got too big.
I wanted to respond to Liz's point. She's not here, but I'll respond to it anyway. Can they learn a word for a number? And I mentioned that the kids had signs or numbers for houses and signs for bus routes that were in the hundreds. So they were able to do things like 119, which is 119, 118. They were using those kinds of numbers just fine and still not able to count.
But that's a label number, Judy.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I'm saying they did indeed learn the label for the number 9, and yet they couldn't use it as a number. That's what I was responding to your point, saying that they do have these like bus labels like 119, 118, 103, and they can for house numbers, bus numbers, things like that, and yet in the hundreds, but couldn't count.
But it's not ordered.
One last quick question from Mark.
Well, I was going to, the fellow went from 12 to 22 or whatever. Judging how bad is bad, I mean, he's inventing his notation system on the spot. Am I right? He's trying.
Well, he talks about numbers in his regular life.
But he hasn't been asked necessarily to
No,
he's been able to avoid these sorts of things.
Yes.
So as a control for, I mean, I've never done a slide rule. I understand logarithms perfectly well. I've never done an abacus. I'm just wondering, you know, a nice control would be how bad are we at some skills that we plausibly understand fully well, but new notation systems somehow involved with it. I would bet that if you pick the right ones, will be fairly embarrassingly terrible, right, compared to what some foreign children who do this would do.
I mean, that's the role of the hearing people who haven't been to school, who are like the home signers in that they haven't had formal education, and they also haven't been confronted with these kinds of tasks, right, at all. But they perform extremely well, relying on the count list they have from Spanish. So that, I think, addresses your point.
But they already have a count list, right?
They have a count, right? They are Spanish speakers.
Okay, I think we need to wrap up. Half an hour for coffee, and then Liz will enlighten us by tying everything together and telling us what it all means.